Today we have a crazy story of revenge against a neighbor. We'll get into that in a bit, but first, I got back at my ex-husband for cheating on me. My ex-husband Kelvin and I met through a mutual friend, Alice. We immediately hit it off and started dating, and before we knew it, we were married with 2 children, a boy and a girl. At the time, my husband took a bold step to resign from his workplace and ventured into real estate. It wasn't easy to start up, but I worked at a paper company, so I was able to help financially to the best of my effort. And before we knew it, business was good and my husband was making enough to cover our needs. Fast forward to 20 years later, both our kids were grown. My daughter was 18 at the time, while my son was 19. Everything was fine, or so I thought. I never suspected anything was going on with my husband since we weren't the most openly affectionate type. But we always told each other everything from work issues to business deals and the children's upkeep. We shared funny videos with each other during work. My husband had a good sense of humor, which was one of his qualities that I was attracted to when we first met. So there was nothing to suspect even during days when he would claim to travel for business. I believed him. Whenever he came back late from work, I didn't have any reason to question him, since he always makes sure to notify me of his lateness beforehand. When I started to notice something was off was how careful he was with his phone. My husband was never the careful type. He always misplaced his car keys, wristwatch, you name it. He never cared about his phone whereabouts, but recently, he'd been more cautious with his phone, taking it with him to the bathroom and always checking his phone each time he gets a notification. I got curious and decided to check out his phone. I managed to pry it from his hands without him noticing. He was busy watching a TV show at the time and typed in his password, but to my surprise, he had changed it. Now I was suspicious. Kelvin never cared about things like that, and he had no reason to change his password since no one at home invaded his privacy. My son was in college and my daughter was mostly at her friend's place, so most times it was always me and him. I knew something was up, and I decided I was going to find out what was going on. The problem was that I had no idea on how to go about it. Kelvin's social media platforms were business related. Hardly you would see him post a picture, but when he did, they were mostly pictures taken with me and the kids. I had gone through his Instagram and Facebook and there was nothing incriminating, so I assumed I was in over my head. I told a friend of mine, the one who introduced me to my husband, Alice, and she assured me I had nothing to worry about as Kelvin wasn't the type to do such. I decided to pay my husband a surprise visit to his office just to be sure. I impulsively went straight to his office during my lunch break after my talk with Alice. It must have also been their lunch break because the office was empty. There was no staff in sight, yet the door wasn't locked. I remembered thinking my husband must have forgotten to lock up before heading out. I was about to leave when I heard a sound coming from my husband's main office. I peeped inside, and yep, you guessed it, I saw husband cheating on me with a business partner I met once or twice. She came to our house once to talk business with him. Needless to say, it wasn't a pretty sight. They were so focused on one another, they didn't even notice my presence. I left his office feeling so dumbfounded. I never expected it to be her. She never came to mind. I felt so angry and confused at the same time. I didn't know what to do. I knew I was so mad at him I couldn't bear to be in the same house as him that night, or I might say or do something I would regret, so I went to stay over at Alice's place and called my daughter to let her know. My husband kept calling, but I ignored his call. I couldn't deal with him. Alice was surprised at the news. She kept asking me what I was going to do. I had no idea. I kept thinking about whether or not to confront him. I kept thinking of how long he must have been cheating, and that just upset me even more. I took time off work under the disguise of being sick and went home to meet an empty house. My daughter arrived shortly from school and I asked about her dad. She said he never stayed the night at home. He went out a few hours after he got back from work and never came back, which meant me not being at home was an opportunity for him to cheat. And in that moment, I made up my mind I was getting a divorce. I immediately got in contact with a lawyer from work and asked if he could take my case. He told me he didn't deal with divorce but referred me to a lawyer who could handle my case. My husband came home that evening without suspecting anything. He asked about my stay with Alice. At the time, I wanted to punch his lying, cheating face, but I held back and told him we had a girls' night which got extended. A lot was going on in my head. If I really wanted to go through with the divorce, how my kids would react, maybe it wasn't something serious. Why would he cheat on me? My husband and I have fought a couple of times, but we always resolved it, but this was serious. I decided to wait it out. Maybe it was a fling that would end. Months passed and things were worse. The signs I was oblivious to began to show. More late-night meetings and extended business trips. My husband was hardly ever at home, and worse, he actually thought he was having me fooled. And I felt so mad at myself for being foolish enough to think he would stop, and at my husband for playing me for a fool. I got the lawyer's contact and started working on my divorce, but I felt like divorce was too easy for him. I kept thinking of how to pay him back in the place that would hurt him most, and all I could think about was his funds, his hard-earned money. I didn't want to sue him for his money. I wanted him to feel hurt by the sudden disappearance of it. So I began forging a plan on how to hack into my husband's account and steal his money. I knew I had to get someone trusted with a certain level of expertise to help with that, and I must have access to some information about his business account. We had a joint account where he mostly kept money for different expenses and a business account for work. I never thought I would ever need access to his work account, so I never bothered myself with finding out information about it. I knew I had to be smart to get his password, so at night, without raising suspicions. On a particular night, I brought up a conversation about a coworker whose husband's account got hacked. My husband likes to give his opinion on different matters. That was one of his attributes that made him a good businessman, which was why I wasn't surprised when he went on about how one should be careful with their money and how he has several business accounts in case of any threat to his money. I kept up with the conversation and opposed his idea, telling him the account is not the problem, it's the password. The conversation went on, and I was able to get the intended information I needed from him. I worked in a paper company, so I knew a few colleagues of mine who were good with computers, but I needed someone who wasn't easily traceable and didn't know who I was. So I told Alice about my idea to get back at my husband. She thought I was joking at first. I think it had to do with the fact that I was an easygoing person who never liked trouble. When she saw how serious I was, she changed her composure and told me she knew someone who could help with that. Mind you, Alice worked at a bank, so it was like fate was on my side. I never even considered bringing anyone into my plan. I was just bent on seeing it through. I was really hurt then, and I knew nothing anyone said or did would have stopped me. Alice asked about my plan, which I reluctantly spilled to her, and she helped me open a personal account. To be honest, at the time, I never expected Alice to help me out with my plan since she was friends with Kelvin and I. But seeing her take my side without question just made me grateful to have her in my corner. Alice introduced me to a former colleague of hers who initially worked as a banker. I was skeptical and scared, but she assured me there was nothing to worry about. We got started on the plan, and to be honest, it didn't really take as much time as I thought it would. I was shocked at how easy it was to gain access to a person's account. Most of the information I had gathered with the intention of using it weren't even needed. Maybe it was because he was a former banker, or that was just how easy it is to gain access to people's money. A few minutes later, the money was wired into a new account Alice had helped me set up. And I wouldn't lie, I felt guilty at first, but my husband's reaction at home made it worth my stress. And it was quite a huge amount. I kept consoling him, telling him how hackers had gotten smarter now and he needed to be more careful with his money. It was great seeing him getting fooled by me and not know a thing, and what was worse was that he had no idea I was going to divorce him. I knew my marriage was over months ago. I was just afraid to let go. But seeing my husband every night fueled a certain level of anger I couldn't explain. Whenever he slept peacefully by my side while I was deep in thought on what to do, that made me angrier, and whenever I see him busy on his phone, I just assume he was talking to her. I knew if I stayed with him any longer, I would never trust him, and that would take a toll on me. So a few months after the money incident, which my husband was still struggling to recover from, I served his cheating butt divorce papers. He was so shocked by it, and even more shocked that I knew about his affair. I never told the kids the real reason for our divorce. I left that part to him. It was an amicable divorce. I never asked for anything since I already got the money. He surprisingly left the house for me and apologized to the kids and I. I asked him why he cheated, and he said he loved her. That hurt. I got myself an Audi as a reward for myself from the money. Months later, I heard from Alice that he broke up with her. It came as a surprise to me, mostly because I thought he was in love with her. The kids and I live together. They sometimes visit their dad, which I do not question. Each time I remember the money incident, I laugh to myself. I don't think he ever knew I was responsible for that. All I can say is this guy was clearly over OP. All of his money disappeared, OP divorced him, he gave up a bunch of assets, he kind of just walked off into the sunset despite losing practically everything, being almost okay with it. I mean, OP clearly won, but it doesn't sound like he's really all that beat up about it. Our next story is how I pranked a manipulative patient into believing she was really sick. I remember a funny encounter I had with a strange girl during my first year as a nurse. I had just graduated from college and had gotten my first job as a nurse. I was so excited to finally start making money after a lot of practical and theoretical work. They were going easy on the newbies generally in the hospital at the time, so it was mostly changing of drips and keeping tabs on patients, nothing too serious. It must have been 2 weeks into the job when 2 teenage girls entered into the hospital. One was holding on to her friend who was complaining of an intense stomach ache. The doctors began their work, and before I knew it, she was admitted to the hospital. Her friend, let's call her Betty, refused to leave her side, saying she wouldn't leave her alone despite her friend's parents' arrival. The parents didn't think much of it. They were quite close with each other, so they allowed her to stay. I remember thinking it must be so nice to have a wonderful friend like Betty without realizing she was a devil in disguise. Now, Betty's friend, let's call her Claire, had been hospitalized for appendicitis, which ruptured and had been surgically removed. Normally, she would have been discharged from the hospital within a day or two, but the doctor wanted to make sure she wasn't at risk of infection. She had to stay for a week. Betty was always there to help out her friend since her parents had to go to work. The first and second day, I was fine with it, but it had been 3 days and Betty was still in the hospital with her friend. Out of concern, I went to meet her to ask about school and her classes. I told her she had nothing to worry about. We would care for her friend, and she was always welcome after school hours. Her friend would probably be discharged by the end of the week. Betty gave me the coldest glare ever, sending shivers down my spine. Then she responded telling me it was none of my business how she decides to spend her time. I wasn't her mother. That got me thinking, where exactly were her parents? Did they have any idea that their daughter had been spending so much time at the hospital and were just fine with it? It was day 4 and Betty was still in the same clothes at the hospital, going around like she owned the place. She kept going to the vending machine and it didn't help that she smelled terrible. I wanted to mind my business as usual, but I just felt bad that everyone kept covering their nose when she passed, and either she had no idea or didn't care. It was a bad work environment. I needed to do my job despite what some 16-year-old had to say, so I went into Claire's room, which reeked, by the way. I could see her friend doing her best to hold her breath. The poor girl must have been pretending so as not to hurt her friend, but I was the adult and I knew my job. I sent Betty home on the grounds that she would be thrown out by security and not be allowed into the hospital if she didn't go home and take a quick bath. I could tell that she was angry, but I didn't care. I also told her that she was welcome anytime as long as she had showered and was in a clean set of clothes. As soon as Betty left, her friend thanked me for intervening. She said she had no idea what to do. She had been trying to get Betty to leave, but Betty was adamant on staying. I was shocked when I saw Betty about an hour later looking clean. I had never seen anyone go and come back so fast. What was her deal, I thought to myself. She went back to her friend's room, giving me the middle finger as she passed by. Well, freak you too, Betty, I thought to myself. I went about doing my duties as usual and came back to check on Claire and other patients I was responsible for before ending my shift. I remembered keeping each patient chart at the required section, then going home for the night with the intention of sleeping. I got a call from a nurse working night shift asking for Claire's chart, which I specifically made sure to keep at the appropriate section. She kept telling me it wasn't there and I should come check it out myself. I was confused but went to the hospital. To my surprise, they were right. Claire's chart was missing. I was the last person responsible for her. I went around each room frantically checking everywhere I could think of. I didn't want to lose a job I had just gotten on the grounds of carelessness. I kept searching till dawn when Betty came out holding the chart with an innocent look on her face, saying she saw the chart underneath Claire's bed. I knew that little demon took the chart and secretly hid it, but I couldn't say a word. My colleague made fun of me for being so careless. I was so embarrassed, I kept apologizing to my boss and the nurse in charge of Claire the night before. Luckily for me, I was pardoned since I was still a newbie. I was told not to feel too bad. It happened a lot more than I thought. I could feel Betty's eyes on me from time to time. Once our eyes met and she had an angry look on her face, I returned her stare till she backed down. This girl had a lot of audacity. If anyone should be upset, it was me who was almost affected by her obvious childish display this morning. It was clear that she had a problem with me and I wasn't a fan of her either. Claire's parents came to check up on their daughter the next day and were surprised to see Betty was still hanging around and asked her to go home. That finally got her to leave. This gave me the chance to talk to Claire when her parents left for the night. I knew teenagers like to talk generally about school, boys, and life problems they were facing, so it was easy to indulge her in a conversation. I asked her what was up with Betty, and she went on about how Betty was the only child whose mom and dad were divorced. She lived with her mom, who was hardly ever around, so most of the time she always stayed at her house. That explained a lot. I honestly felt sad for Betty and decided to let the chart incident go. She was just being rebellious, and I understood what prompted her to be that way. On the day Claire was officially cleared to be discharged, Betty came around to help her friend pack up. I didn't pay much attention to her. It was a very busy day at the hospital. We were getting bombarded with work and the stress was starting to get to me. Claire was set to leave. I came to say a quick goodbye to her and they were off. The next week came. I was doing my duties as usual when a coworker of mine assigned to a patient came to inform me about my ex-patient friend being brought to the hospital. I went and checked out who she was talking about, and I saw Betty complaining about feeling sick with Claire by her side. The doctor in charge was a friend who explained to me that she arrived earlier and had been trying to figure out what was wrong. He had done several tests but found nothing. At first, I found it odd, but decided it was none of my business. I was just happy to have dodged a bullet. He kept checking up on her constantly, but her blood pressure was normal, heartbeat was fine, all the tests came out negative, and he began to worry. He was also new to the job like I was. I advised him to get through to her parents. Maybe she had a medical history he wasn't aware of. He called her mom several times, but he was told she was in a meeting. We tried explaining to whoever was on the line that her daughter was in a critical condition, but the lady just laughed and told us not to bother ourselves. She was just faking. At first, I didn't take what the person had said seriously because I saw no reason for someone sane to do that. Then I remembered how manipulative Betty could be and decided to check on her. She was checked into a private ward at her request. I was passing through when I heard sounds of someone laughing. I carefully peeped inside her room and caught Betty laughing hysterically at something Claire said. So much for being sick. I wanted to inform her doctor about her faking her sickness, but an idea came to my head. If she wanted to be sick, then maybe she needed to believe she was really sick. I found a way to lure Claire into an empty room to confirm my suspicion. I had to be 100% sure she was faking before asserting my plan into motion. After a lot of guilt tripping from my side, I managed to get Claire to talk, and I was right. Betty had been faking. But in Claire's defense, she told me Betty wanted to get her mother's attention and begged her to go along with her plan. After confirming my suspicions, I went ahead to forge a test result confirming Betty had been diagnosed with a deadly infectious disease. To be more specific, a viral disease. The look of horror on her face when I shared the news with her was everything I imagined and more. She confessed that she'd been joking around earlier. She hadn't really been sick, and I told her it was a good thing she came into the hospital, otherwise we wouldn't have been able to figure it out. She kept pacing around, screaming her life was over in tears. To be honest, I started to feel bad for taking it that far and decided to call it off. I waited for about 30 minutes before telling her that I made a mistake and the test report was actually for another patient, not hers. Then she went all angry mode and made a scene telling me she would make sure I go to jail, that she knew I did that on purpose to get back at her. I gave her a confused look, asking her why I would want to get back at her when she hadn't done anything wrong to me. She couldn't say anything about the prior chart incident, knowing fully well my boss and colleagues were present in the room. I apologized to her since my boss and colleagues were present. She kept insisting on suing me, which was funny considering she'd also been faking. When she refused to give up, we also threatened to sue her for deceiving the staff in the hospital. That shut her up. Eventually, she gave up and went home with her friend, and that was the last we saw of her. I was suspended this time. I was just glad to have given a spoiled brat like Betty a taste of her own medicine. Now that I think about it, it was a very reckless move putting my job on the line just to get back at a patient, but I've never once regretted it. After my suspension was over, I went back to work and got back to my normal routine. It was obvious that Betty was struggling with loneliness and had some deep mummy issues. I hope she was able to get the appropriate help she needed. Honestly, I'm just kind of glad that this was more for like an attention-seeking thing, and it wasn't for something actually a little bit more disappointing to find out. Like, some people do this kind of stuff, faking injuries or faking illness so that they can get some kind of quick meds. That said, like OP said, it was very dumb of them to put their job on the line for some weird attention-seeking patient. Our next story is a neighbor that reminded me of my past. I'd always wanted to live in Washington, D.C. In short, I could describe myself as one who was obsessed with that place for the longest time possible until I got a chance to live there. Let me give you a background story. As a child, I lived in Texas with my parents, a place I loved wholly. But there was a part of me that loved to visit my aunt, let's call her Jay, in Washington, mainly because I was trying to stay far away from home. My aunt has lived there with her family for as long as I've known her. My aunt had a beautiful family, and she was married to the most thoughtful man ever. Sometimes I used to wonder how one person could be so lucky and sweet. I mean, she had it all as far as I was concerned. And together with all that, my aunt was the sweetest and most beautiful human I have ever met. Each year I looked forward to summer because I knew I got to travel to see my aunt and her family in my favorite state. Thus, in my formative years, I had a strong desire to move to Washington, and I did that when I could. Unfortunately, when I moved there, my aunt had passed away, and my cousins had moved to different cities. The only things I had left were memories and dreams. I got a job and I settled down in a quiet neighborhood. I mean, it was quiet when I moved in, and I remember choosing to stay in that neighborhood because of its quiet environs. However, I noticed the subtle noise in the compound I lived in every other day. But I took it as one of those things. But it became frequent, and I became worried. I mean, I would literally be in the midst of a chore and I would hear a sharp noise from nowhere. Eventually, I began to listen carefully. I needed to know where these incessant screams came from and hopefully find out from whom. It happened every other day, so it wasn't long to discover where the noise came from. It was from the flat next to mine, and after a careful examination, I noticed that my neighbor was hitting her child. The first encounter I had with that neighbor was both weird and funny. It was on the way to my parking lot. She was driving out while I was driving in. She had blocked the entrance to my driveway because she needed to run back into her apartment to pick up what she had forgotten. Oblivious to what was happening, I honked my car repeatedly to create awareness regarding the situation because I'd hoped that the owner of the car would be around the neighborhood. After about 2 minutes, I saw her run out of her apartment frantically, and I could tell she was in great haste. She stormed into her car and drove off quickly. I waited for some minutes to drive into my own parking lot, and all she could do was storm out the way she did. That scenario wasn't enough to form an opinion concerning my neighbor, but somehow I could see that she wasn't my kind of person. Some months into that encounter, that scream didn't stop. If I must say, it became tougher for the little girl who was constantly hurt by this lady. I managed to find out if this lady was the child's mother, and I was shocked to hear that she was. Those experiences triggered some memories inside me. I have memories of how I was severely abused as a child. I was abused physically and mentally by my parents. That formed a major reason why I like to go on long summer holidays down here in Washington, D.C. As a child, I felt so unloved and unseen in my own home. I was hit by my mom on the littlest things ever, and I remember how she would threaten to do worse if I screamed or told anyone. I didn't know why, but she seemed so unstable and vile. Both my parents were alcoholics, and I used to wonder why they chose each other. Was it because they had a lot in common? My dad was no better. He didn't hit me, but he did nothing when my mom did. He would walk to the far end of the room to avoid having to see me cry. Something in me told me he wanted my mom to stop, but he had no effrontery to make the move to stop her, despite being the dad in the house. At least, that was what I called him. At school, I couldn't measure up. I was that girl who was left out and socially awkward. I couldn't say anything, and anytime I tried to say something, it usually sounded nonsensical. I didn't like it, so I became a person of little words, and sometimes I simply had nothing to say. That was the reason I made Washington my faraway home. Half of the time, my body, soul, and spirit were in Washington, even when I was in Texas. That happened because it was my aunt who made me feel seen, wanted, and loved the most. One of the things I was mostly grateful for was how my parents didn't prevent me from traveling that far every summer. That was also where I was most alive. To me, Washington was freedom, love, and acceptance. That was when I first heard that my parents had gotten married to each other because my mom was pregnant with me. They decided to have me, which meant they had to get married since they both agreed not to have me out of wedlock. I think that wasn't the best decision to make because it turned out that they were broken parents who were raising a broken child. When my aunt passed, I was the most devastated. I was literally inconsolable, and I felt that I wouldn't be able to find that comfort anywhere again. I moved to Washington when I got older, and for the first few months, I visited all the places I went with my aunt. There were days I did them in tears, and there were days I was grateful to have found a home and a family in Washington. Washington, to me, was redemption. So the screams and the piercing of that little child were the screams of me when I was that little. I knew that I would save that child, and I wouldn't stop until I did. One day, after an intensive session, I saw the police at that lady's doorstep, but I wasn't surprised when both mother and child pretended to have everything under control. I could see how many times the child nodded in a bid to say she was perfect and fine, and that there was no cause for alarm. Poor child. I could imagine how many times her mother had told her not to tell anyone that she was being abused. I kept watching for a closer cue on how to step in. I was thankful when I saw that little child running across the lawn one evening. I was just fortunate to be taking my daily walk. She ran across me, and I almost couldn't keep myself from calling her to me. Just when I thought I should walk alone, I heard a scream from behind. It turned out that she had had a fall, and it was bad. I was surprised at my spontaneity. I literally leaped towards her with so much grit. As I bent to lend a helping hand, I could see the fear in her eyes and maybe the pain her body had to endure too. Just as I was trying to bend over to help, she released herself from my grip, and in a twinkling of an eye, she dashed away in those hurrying legs. I didn't know why, but I smiled. She was a frightened child, and I didn't expect her to warm up to strangers easily. The day after that, I heard some loud thuds from their apartment as I passed by during one of my evening walks. I don't know what triggered me, but I knew I wasn't going to stop when I decided to have a word with her supposed mother. I made a U-turn as I walked towards their home. I approached the door with as much calmness as I could muster because I was angry and still needed to be sure that my suspicions were true. I knocked once and the door flung open. The lady was at the door and she was heaving heavily. I was shocked by the way her face shone. I can't seem to describe it, but it was terrible. I asked her warmly if they were all right, that I'd heard a loud noise earlier. I told her I was a neighbor, a position I knew she was already aware of. She said I should stay out of her business before she called 911. That was certainly not the reply I was expecting from her. At that point, it was glaring that she was hitting her child and there was no way she was going to hide. I wanted to barge into the apartment, find my way through, and get that child out, but I knew that would mean that I was trespassing, so I left before I created a scene. But I knew I needed to speak up. As I walked away, I was proud of the woman I grew into. Despite everything I'd been through, I was still willing to save another child just as my aunt saved me. There was a child who was being abused and she needed to be saved. I could see the fear in her eyes and how frail she looked. She reminded me of when no one paid attention to my plight. So many times I'd tried to call the Child Protective Services team, but I would change my mind when I remembered that I would be taken away. It was strange that I kept believing that my parents were my parents, no matter what, and I had secretly hoped that they would evolve into the kind of parents I wanted, and we would live as one big family. I was wrong, and I seemed to realize it more when I kept spending time far away from home. I knew that deep down that our home would never be that home. One Monday morning, I dressed smartly in a teal green silky dress. I wore light makeup that was bold enough to enhance the physical features of my face. I walked into the social services office and I had only one request, which was for them to visit my neighbor's house. I told them that I suspected that their child was suffering from a severe form of abuse. I chipped in one or two words which made it look so urgent. I was in my apartment when the social workers arrived. I had intentionally taken the week off from work because I didn't want to miss that moment, because I had a feeling that they would come. My neighbor had not hit her child that day or the day before, but the social workers were smart enough to identify a child who was frightened, abused, and in danger. Days later, I got news that the social workers found out that my neighbor had been inflicting pain on herself because she was depressed. At that moment, I was proud of myself to have rescued that child just in time. I thought the neighborhood was better without a crying child, but I was shocked to have gotten threats from my neighbor who said I was the reason why her child was taken away. I took the threats in no small measure, as I got her reported immediately. She was arrested, and she was placed under close surveillance while she underwent therapy. It honestly sucks that it took somebody like OP who was able to identify a situation like that through an experience of their own growing up to finally have somebody make sure that somebody steps in and saves this kid. But despite all the negatives of what happened, at least OP was there to save this kid. Maybe it was fate that brought OP to be next door neighbors to them. But with that being said, that's all the time we have for today. Now, if you want to hear another crazy revenge story, check out that video on the left. Or if you missed my latest video, check out that video on the right. That said, I'll see you all next time with some more stories.